Welcome to Calvin's Stories, where a man who built everything refuses to be erased. Enjoy.
My name is Declan Phillips. I'm 45 years old. On a Thursday evening in late September, I sat in my truck in the parking lot of my own office building in Columbus, Ohio, reading an email thread my son never meant for me to see. 3 participants, 7 messages, and the phrase, window of compliance, appeared 3 times, each time referring to me, to my mind, to the narrow stretch of months they believed they had before I became too difficult to manage. My son, my daughter-in-law, and a real estate attorney I'd never hired. What I found in that group email thread changed the locks on every building I own. But not that night. That night, I just sat in the cab of my truck with the engine off and the parking lot lights buzzing overhead, and I read the thread twice more until the words stopped blurring. Then I put the phone face down on the passenger seat and pressed both palms flat against the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Before I tell you what I did next, and how I dismantled every lie my son built around me without raising my voice once, I need to take you back to the beginning, because what he did wasn't sudden. It was a construction project, and I should know. I've been in the construction of things my entire adult life. If this story is already landing somewhere familiar for you, I'd ask you to hit subscribe and stay with me through the whole thing. This channel tells stories about people who were underestimated by the people closest to them and what happened when the underestimation met the truth. If that's your kind of story, you're in the right place. So drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from. And if you've ever had someone in your family describe your generosity as something other than what it was, I think you'll understand what comes next. To understand how I ended up reading that email in a dark parking lot, you have to go back about 22 years to a version of me that most people wouldn't recognize. I was 23 when I bought my first commercial property, a 2-unit strip building on the east side of Zanesville, Ohio. Nothing glamorous. A barbershop on one side, a tax preparer on the other. The seller was a 71-year-old man named Harold Bevins, who'd owned the building since 1974 and was retiring to live near his daughter in North Carolina. When we closed, he pulled a brass key ring out of his jacket pocket. Heavy thing. Had every key he'd ever cut for that building on it, going back decades. He pressed it into my hand and said, "Take care of the tenants, and the building takes care of you." I clipped my own keys onto that ring. Over the next 2 decades, I added 11 more buildings. Secondary markets across Ohio, Zanesville, Chillicothe, Newark, Lancaster, a couple in the Columbus metro, nothing flashy. Strip retail, small office, light industrial. The kind of properties that don't make magazine covers but pay their mortgages and keep their tenants employed. Phillips Property Group, just me, a part-time bookkeeper, and eventually my son. My wife Claire died of leukemia when Garrett was 14. I don't talk about that period in a linear way because it wasn't linear. It was a collapse that happened in stages. And then it was just me and a boy who looked exactly like his mother, standing in a kitchen that still smelled like her shampoo. And I had to figure out how to be enough. I don't know if I was. I tried. I funded every ambition he expressed. I co-signed his first apartment when he was 19. I brought him into the company when he was 22, created a junior management role so he could learn how commercial property works from the inside. Lease structures, tenant relations, insurance layers, title transfers, operating account management. I taught him everything I knew because I believed I was building something we would hold together. Phillips and Phillips, father and son. That was the picture in my head every time I handed him another responsibility. What I didn't see, or what I chose not to see, was that Garrett wasn't learning the business because he loved the business. He was learning the machinery because he wanted to operate it alone. 7 months before the email in the parking lot, I was in a car accident. Nothing catastrophic. Rear-ended at a stoplight on Route 33 outside Lancaster. My truck was fine. I hit my head on the side window. Mild concussion, the ER doctor said. Rest, fluids, follow up in 2 weeks. I did all of that. I was fine within a month. But during one meeting about 3 weeks after the accident, I lost a word. Just one. I was explaining a lease renewal term to a tenant, and the word amortization disappeared from my mouth. I could feel the shape of it, could feel where it lived in my vocabulary, but it wouldn't come out. I paused. I said, the payment schedule restructuring instead. The tenant didn't notice. Garrett did. He was sitting in the corner of my office during that meeting, and I saw his eyes change. Not with concern, with something else. Something that looked like calculation. 2 weeks later, my banker, a man named Paul Serrano, whom I'd worked with for 11 years, called me and asked, very carefully, how I was feeling. Not in the way people ask when they're being polite, in the way people ask when they've been told something. I said I was fine. He said, good. He said he was glad. He hesitated before he hung up. 3 weeks later, I'd understand why the banker hesitated. That Tuesday, I just thought he was being cautious. What Garrett did was this. He took that single word-finding episode, a known and temporary symptom of post-concussion recovery, and he turned it into a narrative. He told Paul Serrano that I was having memory issues. He told my insurance broker, a woman named Dana Whiting, the same thing. He told tenants. He told colleagues. He constructed, carefully and deliberately, a story in which his father was experiencing early onset cognitive decline, and he, the dutiful son, was stepping in to manage the transition. He didn't need me to be sick. He just needed everyone else to believe I was. And the only reason it almost worked is because I taught him everything he knows about how property transfers work. That's the sentence that sat in my chest like a stone for months. That's the one I couldn't swallow down no matter how many times I tried. The first thing I noticed was a number. $2,200 a month, auto-drafted from the Phillips Property Group operating account to an entity called DMP Ventures LLC. I found it on a Tuesday afternoon in July while reconciling the quarterly books, something I still did myself because I never fully trusted software to catch what eyes could catch. DMP Ventures. I didn't recognize the name. I didn't recognize the EIN. I searched the Ohio Secretary of State's business registry and found it had been registered 4 months earlier. The registered agent was Maeve Phillips, my daughter-in-law. I sat with that for a full day before I said anything. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted there to be an explanation that didn't require me to rethink my son's character. I told myself maybe Garrett had mentioned it, and I'd forgotten. Maybe it was a side project he'd discussed with me during one of my post-concussion foggy weeks, and it had slipped past me. I gave him every benefit of every doubt, because that's what you do when the alternative is unbearable. Then Frank Meyer called. Frank owns Meyer Printing. He's been leasing Building 4 in Newark since 2011. Longest standing tenant I have. Good man. Pays on time. Calls me directly when the HVAC acts up instead of sending passive-aggressive emails. Frank called me on a Wednesday morning and said, Declan, I'm not trying to cause trouble, but can you explain why I'm being asked to send rent to a different entity? He said he'd received a letter on Phillips Property Group, letterhead instructing him to redirect future payments to DMP Ventures LLC, citing a management restructuring. The letter had my signature at the bottom. I asked him to send me a photo of the letter. He did. I stared at it for a long time. The letterhead was right. The formatting was right. The signature at the bottom looked like mine at first glance. But here's the thing about signatures. Mine has been the same for 22 years. I sign my full name, Declan G. Phillips, and the G in my middle initial has a specific loop that I've never changed. The signature on that letter had a different G. It was close. It was practiced. But it was wrong in a way that only I would notice, or someone who'd watched me sign 1,000 documents. The G in Garrett looks almost identical to mine except for one thing. His pen lifts between the downstroke and the crossbar. Mine doesn't. My son forged my signature and he used the wrong practice version. I didn't confront him. I want you to understand that, because everything that happened next depended on it. I didn't call him into my office. I didn't phone him that night. I didn't mention it at Sunday dinner. I put the phone down. I closed the quarterly books. And I began to pay very careful attention to everything. Within 10 days, the scope of what Garrett had done became clear, and it was worse than rent redirection. Dana Whiting, my insurance broker, called to confirm whether I'd really authorized my son to restructure the property liability coverage on buildings 6 and 9. She said Garrett had contacted her office directly, said he was handling things now because of my health, and submitted paperwork removing me as named insured on 2 of my own buildings. 2 buildings I'd owned for 15 and 11 years, respectively. Dana said she'd processed the initial request, but something had felt off, which is why she was calling me. I told her not to process anything further without hearing my voice directly on the phone. She agreed. She sounded relieved. Then came Sunday dinner. Maeve made pot roast. She's a good cook. She was smiling as she set the platter on the table, and she waited until we were all seated, me, Garrett, Maeve, and their 2-year-old daughter, before she said it. Casual, like she was mentioning the weather. "Oh, Declan, we've been meaning to tell you. We hired a property management consultant to help lighten your load. Jim Hargrove, he comes highly recommended. He started last week." Maeve smiled across the pot roast. That smile was an appraisal. I didn't react. I said, "That's thoughtful." I asked how much Jim Hargrove charged. Maeve said $4,500 a month, and my son looked at his plate when she said it, which told me he knew exactly what that number meant and exactly where it was coming from. My operating account, a consultant I'd never met, never approved, billing against my business to do a job I was already doing, hired by people who had no authority to hire anyone. But I didn't say any of that. I ate the pot roast. I complimented the gravy. I held my granddaughter on my knee and let her pull at the brass keyring on my belt loop, the same one Harold Bevins gave me in 2003, and I said nothing about what I knew because by then, I understood that knowing was the only advantage I had, and I could not afford to spend it on anger. Then came the call from Paul Serrano at the bank. Paul asked me to come in. "Not on the phone," he said. "In person." When I sat across from him in his office, he closed the door and spoke quietly. He said Garrett had applied for a $500,000 line of credit using buildings 3 and 7 as collateral. He said Garrett had submitted a notarized affidavit claiming to hold durable power of attorney over my affairs. He said the bank's processing timeline was 10 business days, and 7 had already passed. 10 business days. 7 gone, 3 remaining. Paul said he hadn't approved it yet because something about the application felt rushed, and because he'd known me for 11 years, and because the Declan Phillips he knew didn't delegate anything to anyone without telling his banker first. He said he couldn't formally stop the application without cause, but he could slow it down if I could give him a reason. I gave him a reason. I told him no power of attorney existed. I told him the affidavit was forged. I told him my son had been telling people I had early onset dementia and that it was a lie. Paul's face changed. He set his pen down slowly. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you realize the story you've been told about them was designed to replace them. He said, "Declan, I'm glad you came in." He said he would flag the application for internal review and suggested I might want to speak with the bank's fraud department. I said I would, but not yet. Not until I was ready to move on everything at once. 3 days to stop a $500,000 credit line. That was my ticking clock. But it wasn't the worst of it. A week later, I discovered that Garrett had called my family physician's office and told them I needed a cognitive evaluation. He claimed to hold healthcare proxy. He attempted to access my medical records. The office manager, a woman named Teresa, who'd known me since Claire's diagnosis, told me she'd refused the request because nothing in their system showed a healthcare proxy on file. She said she wasn't comfortable with how insistent he'd been. My own son tried to get into my medical records so he could build a paper trail of decline that didn't exist. He tried to create evidence of a disease I didn't have so he could take what I'd built while I was still standing in it. And then came the barbecue. Garrett hosted. 40 people, colleagues, neighbors, friends. I arrived and he met me at the gate with a beer and a smile, and he walked me over to a group of men I didn't know, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "This is my father, Declan. He's slowing down a bit. We're transitioning everything over to me." He said it the way you'd say someone was retiring. Warmly, proudly, like he was honoring me by taking my life's work off my hands. And I looked at the faces of those men, those strangers, and I saw they already believed it. They nodded sympathetically. One of them said, "Good for you. Taking care of your old man." And I realized the entire social circle, every professional contact, every casual acquaintance, had been told the same story. Declan Phillips is declining. Declan Phillips can't manage anymore. The sun is stepping up. I stood there with a beer I didn't drink and a hand on my shoulder that felt like a shackle. And I smiled. I nodded. I played the part. Because I was already planning. That night I sat in the empty office at 11 p.m. I pulled out the original deed files from the fireproof cabinet. 12 folders. 12 buildings. 22 years of work. I spread them across the desk under the fluorescent light, and I put my hands flat on the paper, and I said, aloud, to no one, "I built this with my hands. Nobody is taking it while I'm still breathing." No one heard me. No one validated me. I validated myself. And then I opened my laptop, and I began. The thing about being 45 years old and having managed commercial property for 22 years is that you know the system, not in the way a lawyer knows it, from textbooks and case law, in the way a plumber knows pipes. You've had your hands inside it. You know where the joints are weak. You know which forms actually matter and which ones are theater. You know that a forged power of attorney is only as strong as the institutions that accept it, and that every institution has a process for revocation that is faster than the process for approval if you know exactly which office to walk into and exactly what to say. Garrett knew property management. But he learned it from me, and he learned the version I taught a 22-year-old, not the version I'd been refining alone for 2 decades since. He made procedural errors. Every forged document he filed had at least one. The commercial lease guarantee he'd signed me on to used a signature that wouldn't survive a 10-second comparison with my notarized originals at the county recorder's office. The letter redirecting tenant rents cited an authority that doesn't exist under Ohio property law without a recorded transfer of management rights. The power of attorney affidavit was notarized, but it was notarized by a notary who works in Maeve's cousin's insurance office and who never verified my identity or presence because I wasn't there. I spent that first night making a list, not an emotional list, an operational one. Every document Garrett had filed or sent, every institution he'd contacted, every lie he'd told, and to whom, every procedural error in every forged paper. I treated it the way I'd treat a building inspection. Systematic, room by room, every crack cataloged. Then I made a second list. The counter moves. Every corrective filing I needed to make. Every institution I needed to contact. Every lock that needed changing, literal and figurative. And then I made a timeline. I had 3 days before the bank's credit application window closed. I had an unknown amount of time before Garrett tried something else. And I had the knowledge that if I moved on one front, without moving on all of them simultaneously, he'd see it coming and accelerate whatever he was planning next. The email thread had used the phrase, window of compliance. They thought the window was about my mental state declining. They were wrong. The window was mine, and it was about to close on them. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, I had a plan that covered every building, every account, every document, and every lie. I started Monday morning at 8:15 at the Franklin County Recorder's office. I brought originals, every deed, every title, my driver's license, my passport, a recent bank statement with my address, and a notarized affidavit of my own, prepared by a notary I'd worked with for 9 years, a man named Victor Ramos, who'd notarized more of my documents than anyone alive. Victor's affidavit stated that I, Declan Garrett Phillips, was of sound mind, held no durable power of attorney naming any other person, and had not authorized any individual to act on my behalf in any capacity regarding my properties or financial accounts. The county recorder was a woman named Sandra Chen. I had sat across the table from Sandra on probably 40 occasions over the years, filing deeds, recording liens, transferring titles. She knew my signature better than my own son did, which was ironic considering. I laid out the forged documents next to my originals. I showed her the signature discrepancies. I showed her the affidavit from Victor. I explained, in the flat, procedural language Sandra and I had always used with each other, what had happened. The county recorder set her stamp down slowly and looked at me over her glasses. "Declan," she said, "how long has this been going on?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled up every filing made under my name, or my company's name, in the previous 6 months. 3 of them were fraudulent. She flagged them. She began the revocation process on each one while I sat in the plastic chair across from her desk and felt my hands shaking in my lap where she couldn't see them. That was the first domino. The second was the bank. I drove directly from the recorder's office to Paul Serrano's branch. I brought Victor's affidavit. I brought the flagged filings from Sandra's office. I brought the evidence of the forged power of attorney. Paul had already slowed the credit application. Now he stopped it entirely and initiated a formal fraud referral. He closed the compromised operating account, the one DMP Ventures had been drafting from, and opened a new one. New account number, new routing number, new authorized signers. One name only. Mine. While Paul processed the paperwork, I sat in his office and called Dana Whiting. I told her to reverse the insurance restructuring on buildings 6 and 9 immediately. I told her my name was the only name to appear as named insured on any Phillips Property Group policy. She said she'd already been uncomfortable with what Garrett had requested and was relieved to have clear direction. She reversed everything that afternoon. Then I drove to each building. All 12. It took me the rest of Monday and most of Tuesday. At each one, I met with the property manager or tenant directly. I handed them a certified letter on Phillips Property Group letterhead, real letterhead, with my real signature, confirming that I was the sole owner and manager of the property, that no management transition was underway, and that all future communications regarding their lease should come directly from me. I carried a stack of 12 letters. By Tuesday evening, they were all delivered. At Building 4 in Newark, Frank Meyer read the letter, looked at me, and said, "I knew something was off. You don't forget how to run a building, Declan." I shook his hand, and I almost broke right there in his print shop, with the smell of ink and paper around me. But I held it together because I had 6 more buildings to visit before dark. While I was delivering letters, a locksmith named Tony Gardella was changing every lock and reprogramming every access card on every one of my 12 buildings. Tony and I had worked together for 15 years. He'd installed the original access systems in half my properties. I called him Monday morning, explained what I needed, and he cleared his schedule. New locks, new codes, new key cards, every building. The old master key ring on my belt was now the only set of original keys that matched any lock in my portfolio, and even those would be replaced. I kept the brass ring, though. Harold's ring. The keys on it were dead metal now, but the ring itself meant something that new hardware couldn't replace. If someone in your family has ever described your generosity as weakness to someone else's face, you already know the feeling in your stomach right now. The question is what you did next. Tell me in the comments. Wednesday, I dealt with the consultant, Jim Hargrove. I called his office, identified myself as the sole owner of Phillips Property Group, and informed him that his engagement had been terminated effective immediately, that he had been hired without authorization by individuals with no signing authority over my business, and that any invoices submitted to my company would be returned unpaid. Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Phillips, your son told me you were aware of the arrangement." I said, "My son told a lot of people a lot of things." Hargrove terminated his own engagement that afternoon, Thursday. I called my family physician's office and spoke with Teresa. I confirmed that no healthcare proxy existed. I requested that a note be placed in my file stating that no medical information was to be released to any family member without my direct in-person authorization. Teresa said she'd already done that after Garrett's call. She said, "I've known you 20 years, Declan. You're sharper than most of the 30-year-olds who come in here." I thanked her. I almost told her what was happening, but I kept the circle tight. By Friday morning, every piece of infrastructure Garrett had built was gone. Every forged document flagged or revoked. Every account secured, every lock changed, every tenant informed, every insurance policy corrected, every lie he'd told to a professional contact countered by a direct in-person conversation from me, the man they'd known for years, standing in front of them with clear eyes and a steady voice and a stack of documentation that made the truth undeniable. And through all of it, from Monday to Friday, Garrett didn't know. He didn't know because I did what I've always done. I showed up to Sunday dinner. I answered his calls about routine property matters with my usual tone. I walked through the days looking like the same man I'd always been, because I was the same man I'd always been. The difference was that behind the routine, I was dismantling his entire operation, one filing, one phone call, one lock at a time. The cognitive load of those 5 days was something I don't have adequate language for. I was running 2 realities simultaneously. In one reality, I was Dad. Steady Declan. The man who was maybe slowing down a little, sure, but still showing up, still managing, still the father who'd raised his son alone and built something from nothing. In the other reality, I was conducting a systematic counter-operation against my own child, filing fraud documentation against someone whose first steps I'd watched from a kitchen floor in a house that doesn't exist anymore. I want to tell you there was no doubt. I want to tell you I moved through those days with the cold precision of someone who'd made their peace with what had to happen. But that would be a lie. Tuesday night, after the 5th building visit, I sat in my truck in the parking lot of Building 7, and I cried. Not for long, maybe 5 minutes, but I cried the way you cry when the thing you're grieving is still alive and standing in front of you at a barbecue, calling you his father while telling strangers you're losing your mind. Then I wiped my face and drove to Building 8. Thursday night, something happened that almost broke the plan. I was at home in the small office off my bedroom where I keep personal files, organizing the documentation I'd collected that week, when I heard a key in the front door. Garrett had a house key. He'd always had one. I hadn't changed my home locks yet, because I'd been focused on the commercial properties. My hands were shaking before I opened the second attachment of the file I was reviewing, the one from the bank showing the fraudulent credit application. The papers were spread across the desk. If Garrett walked down the hall and looked into this room, he'd see everything. He'd see the revocation filings, the certified letters, the fraud referral from the bank. He'd know. I heard his footsteps in the hallway. I heard him call out, "Dad? You up?" I swept everything into the desk drawer in one motion. I closed the laptop. I walked out of the office and met him in the hallway with my hands in my pockets. "Hey, bud. What's up?" He said Maeve had made extra lasagna, and he'd brought me a plate. He was smiling. He looked like Claire when he smiled, the same jaw, the same way the smile started on the left side first. He handed me the foil-wrapped plate and said, "You look tired. You should rest more, Dad." I took the plate. I said, "I'm fine, just doing some reading." He glanced toward the office door, which I'd pulled shut behind me. "What are you reading?" "Old lease files. You know me." "Can't leave the archives alone." He laughed. He said, "That's exactly what I tell people. Dad's always in the files." Then he left, and I stood in the hallway holding a plate of lasagna made by the woman who'd hired a consultant to bill against my company, and smiled across a pot roast while appraising my mental fitness. And I understood that the warmth my son showed me was a weather pattern, not a climate. It appeared and disappeared based on conditions that had nothing to do with love. I changed the house locks Friday morning. Friday was also the day I dealt with the forged commercial lease, the $340,000 guarantee. I contacted the landlord's attorney, a man named Richardson, directly. I brought my notarized signature exemplars. I brought Victor's affidavit. I brought the flagged filings from the county recorder. I sat across from Richardson in his conference room, and I explained that my son had forged my signature as guarantor, that no power of attorney existed, and that any representation to the contrary was fraudulent. Richardson went pale. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he'd accepted Garrett's documentation in good faith, and he was now realizing that his client's lease had a $340,000 hole in its guarantee structure. He said Garrett had told him I had early onset dementia, and that the son held power of attorney. He said Garrett had been convincing. I said, "He usually is, sir." Richardson voided the guarantee that afternoon. He also told me something I hadn't known. He said Garrett had implied, in their initial meeting, that the dementia narrative was supported by my physician, that Garrett had said the cognitive evaluation was already underway, that the healthcare proxy was in place. Each lie built on the one before it, a house of cards made of my identity. I drove home from Richardson's office and I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes with the engine running. Not because I was having a breakdown, but because I needed to let my body catch up with what my mind had been doing all week. My chest was tight. My jaw was sore from clenching. My shoulders were knotted in a way that felt permanent. I'd been carrying the weight of surgical focus for 5 days while simultaneously performing normalcy, and the body keeps the score, even when the mind insists on staying operational. The truck's heater was blowing warm air against my shins. I could hear the tick of the engine beneath the idle, a faint metallic pulse that sounded like a clock, counting down something already finished. The steering wheel leather was cracked in the spot where my left thumb always rested. Worn, smooth, by 20 years of the same grip. I stared at that crack and realized I'd been gripping the wheel the whole drive home without once adjusting my hands. My fingers ached when I finally let go, each knuckle popping as I straightened them out, one at a time. I turned the engine off. I went inside. I checked the new locks. I ate the last of Maeve's lasagna standing at the kitchen counter, which felt like the most contradictory thing I'd ever done. The kitchen was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional tick of the baseboard heat expanding in the walls. I stood there with a fork in one hand and the foil tray in the other, eating food prepared by a woman who had registered a shell company in her own name to siphon money from my business. And the lasagna was good. It was genuinely good. The ricotta was layered thick. The sauce had been slow cooked. And I hated that I noticed. Hated that I could taste the care in it, while knowing what the hands that made it had signed. I set the empty tray in the sink. I rinsed the fork. I stood at the counter for another minute, my palms flat on the cool laminate, and I listened to the house settle around me. Every creak was familiar. Every sound was mine. No one else had a key anymore. Saturday, I rested. I needed to. I sat in my living room with the curtains open and the master key ring on the coffee table in front of me. The brass ring holding keys that no longer opened anything, and I thought about Claire. I thought about the day we brought Garrett home from the hospital. 9 pounds, 2 ounces. A face like a red fist. And Claire laughing through her exhaustion, saying, "He's going to be a handful." I thought about teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway of the old house, and I thought about the day Claire died, and how Garrett, 14 years old, stood beside me at the hospital bed and didn't cry until we were in the car. And then he cried until he couldn't breathe. And I held him and told him we would be okay. That I would make sure we were okay. I had made sure. I had funded every ambition, co-signed every lease, created every opportunity. And he had taken each one and used it to build a machine designed to take from me everything I'd built before I'd finished building it. Saturday was the day I grieved for my son, not the man in the email thread. The boy in the car. The 14-year-old who lost his mother and whose father decided that enough love could replace what was missing. I grieved for the mistake I made, which was believing the without boundaries would create gratitude instead of entitlement. I sat with that until the light changed in the room and the afternoon was gone. Sunday, I didn't go to dinner. I texted Garrett and said I was tired. He texted back a smiley face and said, "Rest up, Dad. We need you sharp." The performance in that sentence was so precise it almost impressed me. Almost. Monday morning, Garrett drove to the office. He pulled into the parking lot of Phillips Property Group headquarters, the same building where I'd read the email in my truck 10 days earlier. He walked to the door. He held his keycard up to the reader. Nothing happened. He tried again. Nothing. He tried. The physical key. It didn't fit. He stood there in the morning light, in his good shoes and his pressed shirt, holding a key that no longer opened anything. And for the first time since this began, I felt a sensation I didn't expect. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something closer to the feeling when a long, loud noise finally stops and you can hear again. I was watching. From the second-floor window of my office, standing behind the blinds with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand. I could see the top of his head, the way his hair parted on the left side, the same way mine does, the same way Claire's did. I could see him pull his phone from his pocket. I could see the way his posture changed, the way confidence left his shoulders one vertebra at a time, like a building settling into soft ground. He pressed the keycard to the reader a third time, holding it there, as if an extra second of contact might change the outcome. The morning sun was hitting the glass door at an angle that turned it into a mirror, and I realized he could see his own reflection standing there, locked out of a building with his father's name on the deed. I don't know what he saw in that reflection. I know what I saw from above, a man in a pressed shirt, learning that pressed shirts don't open doors. He called me. I didn't answer. He called again. And again. He called 17 times in 4 hours. I let each call go to voicemail. I was in the building, in my office, behind a door with a new lock, reviewing the quarterly books that I'd been too distracted to finish the week before. I could hear my phone buzzing on the desk. I could see his name lighting up the screen. The phone vibrated against the wood surface with a low, persistent rattle, like a trapped insect. I let it ring. Each time the screen went dark and then lit up again. The gap between calls grew shorter. The first few had 4 or 5 minutes between them. By the 8th call, the gap was under 90 seconds. I kept working. The quarterly numbers were clean. They'd always been clean. I reconciled the October rents against the deposit records. I cross-referenced the new account routing numbers against the tenant payment instructions I delivered that week. Everything matched. Everything was in order. The fluorescent light above my desk hummed at the same pitch it had hummed for 11 years, and I sat beneath it doing the work my son told people I could no longer do. While he was calling me, his phone also rang. Paul Serrano at the bank, calling to inform him that the $500,000 credit application had been referred to the bank's fraud department, that the operating account he'd been drafting from had been closed, that any power of attorney documentation previously submitted had been determined to be fraudulent and was now part of an internal investigation. I know this because Paul called me afterward. He said Garrett had been silent on the phone for 11 seconds after hearing the word fraudulent. Paul said he'd counted. 11 seconds of nothing. Then Garrett had said, "There's been a misunderstanding," and Paul had said, "Mr. Phillips, the fraud department will be in touch." And the call ended. Garrett called me 4 more times after the bank called him. The voicemails changed. The first few were casual, confused. "Hey, Dad, my keycard's not working. Can you buzz me in?" Then concerned. "Dad, call me back. Something's going on with the bank. then demanding, "I need you to call me right now." Then quiet. Then the one that told me the full weight had landed. The 17th voicemail was 3 seconds of silence, followed by, "Dad, what did you do?" He didn't say, "What happened?" He said, "What did you do?" Because he knew. In that moment, standing in a parking lot holding dead keys, he understood that the man he'd told everyone was losing his mind had just demonstrated the kind of precise, methodical, comprehensive, operational competence that his son could only aspire to. The man who couldn't find the word amortization had found every forged document, every fraudulent filing, every unauthorized account draft, and had reversed them all in 5 days without making a single phone call his son could overhear. I answered the 18th call. I let it ring 3 times. I picked up. I heard his breathing, fast and shallow, the breathing of a man whose entire structure has just been pulled out from under him. There was traffic noise behind him. He was still in the parking lot. I could hear the same buzzing from the lot lights that I'd heard the night I read the email, though now it was daytime and the lights were off, and the buzzing was something I was imagining or remembering, or both. I heard him start to speak and then stop. I heard him swallow. The sound was dry, like paper tearing. I said 5 words. "You have your own life to build now. I suggest you start." I heard a sound from his end that might have been the beginning of my name, or might have been the beginning of a word he couldn't find. The way I couldn't find amortization that day in the office, except what he was missing wasn't a term from a textbook. It was the opening syllable of whatever he thought could be said to a father who'd just locked every door between them with documentation. Then I hung up. The phone sat on my desk. The screen went dark. The office was quiet. I could hear the fluorescent light humming above me, and the distant sound of traffic on the street below, and the faint tick of the wall clock behind my chair. And I put both palms flat on the desk, the way I'd done 100 times before. And I sat in the silence of a building I owned, in a chair I'd bought, at a desk I'd chosen, in a life no one was narrating for me. 14 seconds passed before I exhaled. Over the next 72 hours, I watched the cascade from a distance. Garrett showed up at Building 4 in Newark. Frank Meyer met him at the door and told him he'd received a letter from Declan confirming sole ownership and management, and that Garrett wasn't authorized to enter the property. Garrett argued. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that his father was confused, that the letters were sent during an episode. Frank, 6'2", and built like the printing presses he operates, didn't move from the doorway. He said, "Declan was in my shop 3 days ago. He wasn't confused about anything. He knew what he was doing, and he knew why." Garrett stepped back. Frank's arms were crossed. The print shop behind him smelled like fresh ink and warm paper, and the machines were running, the low rhythmic thump of the offset press filling the doorway like a heartbeat. Garrett left. He went to Building 6 next. The tenant there, a woman named Audrey Kessler, who runs a tax preparation office, met him in the parking lot before he reached the door. She told him she'd already spoken with Declan, and that she'd been instructed to direct all management inquiries to me personally. Garrett told Audrey that I was having cognitive episodes. Audrey looked at him and said, "Your father sat in my office for 20 minutes on Tuesday. He recited my lease terms from memory, including the escalation clause percentages. He's not having episodes." Garrett didn't go to a third building. Maeve called me twice. The first call was polite. "Declan, there seems to be some confusion about the accounts. Can we sit down and talk?" I didn't answer. The second call, 6 hours later, had a different tone. "Declan, this is getting out of hand. Garrett is beside himself. You're hurting your son." I didn't answer that one either. Her voice on the second voicemail had a quality I hadn't heard before, a tightness at the edges that sounded less like concern, and more like the sound a door makes when you push it and realize it's been bolted from the other side. The silence was the point. Every unanswered call, every unreturned message demonstrated the same thing. The person who once controlled everything now controlled nothing. And the silence from my end wasn't anger or cruelty. It was the absence of a performance I no longer needed to give. For months, I'd been performing the role of a man who didn't know what was happening to him. Now, I was performing nothing. I was just being Declan Phillips, owner of 12 commercial properties in Ohio, sitting in his office, doing his job. The silence had its own weight, its own texture. It sounded like the empty frequency between radio stations, the hiss of a channel with no broadcast, and it was the truest sound I'd made in months. Garrett tried another approach. He started calling people, my tenants, my banker, my insurance broker. He told them there had been a misunderstanding. He told them I was confused, that the changes I'd made were evidence of the cognitive decline he'd been warning them about. He was still trying to run the playbook. But the playbook was dead, because every person he called had already sat across from me, looked me in the eye, reviewed my documentation, and drawn their own conclusions. He was calling witnesses who had already testified. Dana Whiting told Garrett politely that she was only authorized to communicate with me directly and suggested he speak with his own insurance provider. Paul Serrano told Garrett, less politely, that the fraud department would be in touch and that continued contact regarding the flagged accounts would be noted in the investigation file. Frank Meyer didn't answer Garrett's call at all. I later learned from Frank that Garrett had left a voicemail that lasted 45 seconds and contained the phrase, "My father isn't well," 3 times. Frank deleted it without responding. The narrative Garrett had built, the story of a father declining and a son stepping up, collapsed not because I argued against it, but because I showed up. I showed up at every office, every property, every institution, and I was the man they'd known for years, clear-eyed and prepared, holding documentation that told a different story entirely. The truth didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be present. It needed to stand in a room and answer questions and shake hands and remember lease terms and sign its own name with the right G. 4 days after the lockout, Garrett came to my house. I knew he would. I watched from the upstairs window as he pulled into the driveway, sat in his car for a full minute, then walked to the front door. He tried his key. It didn't work. He stood there looking at the key in his hand, turning it over as though the problem might be that he'd inserted it upside down. He tried again. The deadbolt didn't move. He knocked. I didn't answer. He stood on my porch for 7 minutes. He knocked 3 more times. He put his hands on the door frame and leaned his forehead against the wood. And from the window, I could see his shoulders were shaking. The porch light was off. The afternoon was overcast. That particular gray that Ohio does in October, where the sky looks like a ceiling and the light has no direction, no source. Just a flat ambient glow that makes everything look like a photograph taken without flash. His shadow didn't exist. He was just a shape against my door. His forehead pressed to the wood. I'd refinished myself. The summer Claire was diagnosed. And his hands, gripping the frame I'd replaced. When Garrett was 12, because the old one had dry rot, and I'd shown him how to measure and cut and seal the new one, and he'd held the level while I drove the screws. I almost went downstairs. I want to be honest about that. I almost opened the door, not because I was going to change anything, because the shape of him on my porch, shaking, looked exactly like the shape of him at 14. In the front seat of my car the day we lost Claire. And my body remembered what it was supposed to do when my son was in pain. My hand was on the banister. My foot was on the top stair. The distance between us was 14 steps and a deadbolt, and my body wanted to close it the way it had closed every distance between us for 30 years. But my mind remembered what my son had done when his father was vulnerable, My mind remembered the barbecue, the pot roast, the phrase, window of compliance, the forged G, the phone call to my physician, the strangers nodding sympathetically while my son's hand pressed on my shoulder like a claim stake. I stayed at the window. He left after 10 minutes. He walked back to his car slowly, the way you walk when you're not sure your legs are working correctly. He sat behind the wheel for another 2 minutes before starting the engine. I watched his taillights disappear at the end of the street, 2 red points shrinking into the gray afternoon until they turned the corner and were gone. He left a note in the mailbox. I read it later that night. It said, "Dad, I made mistakes. Let me explain. Let me make this right. I love you." I folded the note and put it in the drawer with the rest of the documentation. Because that's what it was. Documentation. Evidence of a man who, when his infrastructure of control was removed, defaulted to the language of love. Because love had always been the tool he understood his father would respond to. The note was written in blue ink on a piece of paper torn from a legal pad. His handwriting was rushed. The I and I love you was pressed so hard it had almost torn through the paper. I noticed that, and I put it in the drawer, and I closed the drawer, and I went to bed. The following week, the fraud department at the bank completed its initial review. The forged power of attorney affidavit had been referred to local law enforcement. The notary who'd certified it, the one from Maeve's cousin's insurance office, had already provided a statement acknowledging that Garrett had been the only person present at the signing, and that she had not verified my identity or presence because I wasn't there. She said Garrett had told her it was routine paperwork and that his father had authorized it by phone. She said she hadn't questioned it because he seemed professional and had proper identification. Her notary commission was suspended pending review. Richardson, the landlord's attorney, had informed his client of the void guarantee, and the client was now pursuing Garrett directly for the $340,000 exposure. Garrett's personal liability on that lease guarantee, a guarantee he'd forged in my name, because his own credit couldn't support it, was now sitting squarely on his shoulders. The landlord's attorney sent Garrett a demand letter. I know this because Richardson called me to confirm my mailing address was not Garrett's mailing address, and during the conversation he said, "Your son is going to need his own attorney, Mr. Phillips." I said I was aware. DMP Ventures, LLC, the shell entity registered to Garrett and Maeve, was flagged by the Secretary of State's office after I filed a complaint documenting the unauthorized drafts from my operating account. The total amount drafted over 4 months was $8,800. Not a fortune, but it was $8,800 taken from a business built by a man his son told the world was losing his mind. Each draft was $2,200. Each one pulled on the first of the month, like rent, like clockwork, like a tenant paying themselves from a landlord's pocket. I didn't sue my son. I want to be clear about that. I filed the necessary fraud reports with the appropriate institutions because the law required it. And because my properties required protection. But I did not hire an attorney to pursue Garrett personally. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his punishment. I wanted him away from what I'd built, and I wanted the truth to be documented in places where it couldn't be rewritten. The property management consultant, Jim Hargrove, sent a final invoice for $4,500. I returned it with a letter explaining that the engagement had been unauthorized. Hargrove didn't pursue it. I later heard from a mutual contact that Hargrove had told people the whole situation was the worst family thing he'd ever walked into. I couldn't argue with that. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt, not the business. The business was fine. The business had always been fine. What I rebuilt was the daily life of a man who no longer had a son in it. I reassigned Garrett's junior management responsibilities to myself. I took back the tasks I delegated to him. It was more work. I didn't mind. The work was clean. The work was honest. The work was mine. I changed my morning routine. I started waking earlier, 5:30 instead of 6:15, and drinking my coffee in the kitchen with the window open, listening to the neighborhood come alive. The first bird usually started at 5:40. A cardinal that lived in the maple tree 2 houses down I hadn't noticed it in years. I hadn't noticed it because I'd been waking up at 6:15 and checking my phone before my feet hit the floor, reading messages from my son about properties he was managing for me or managing away from me. And the cardinal had been singing the whole time into a kitchen where no one was listening. I hadn't done that in years. When Garrett was involved in the business, my mornings had been scheduled around his. Now they were mine. The coffee tasted different when no one was monitoring what time I got up or whether I looked rested enough to be trusted with my own company. I ate dinner alone. I'd been eating dinner alone since Claire died, of course, except for Sunday dinners at Garrett's house. But this was a different kind of alone. This wasn't the loneliness of a widower. This was the solitude of a man who'd chosen his own company over the company of people who'd measured him for replacement. The kitchen was quieter now than it had been before Garrett was involved in the business, which didn't make sense because the kitchen had always been this quiet, but the quiet had changed. Before, the silence had been an absence. Now it was a presence. It had substance. It had texture. It was the sound of a house where every object belonged to the person standing in it, and no one was keeping inventory. There's a kind of quiet that arrives after sustained danger, and I want to describe it to you as precisely as I can because I think it matters. The first morning I woke up after the last piece of the operation was complete. I lay in bed for 20 minutes, not sleeping, not thinking, just lying in a room where no one was undermining me, in a house where every lock answered to my key alone, in a life where every document bearing my name actually bore my name. I listened to the furnace hum. I listened to the house settle. I listened to the absence of a thread I'd been carrying in my body for months without naming it. Outside, the cardinal was singing. The first gray light was pressing against the curtains, not bright enough to illuminate the room, just bright enough to separate the shapes of the furniture from the darkness, the dresser, the closet door, the chair in the corner where Claire used to set out her clothes for the next day. These shapes had been here every morning, and I hadn't seen them clearly in months because I'd been waking into a world that required immediate operational vigilance. And now the world required nothing from me, except that I lie still and breathe. My chest unclenched, not all at once, in stages, like ice melting. I took a breath that went deeper than any breath I'd taken since the barbecue where my son introduced me as a declining man. And I felt my ribcage expand in a way that seemed unfamiliar, like my lungs had forgotten they were allowed to fill completely. I got up. I made coffee. I opened the window. The air that came in was cold and smelled like wet leaves and the particular mineral scent of Ohio soil in late autumn, the smell of ground that's preparing to freeze. I stood at the kitchen counter with both palms flat on the surface, and I let the morning air come in, and I did nothing. I did absolutely nothing for 15 minutes. No emails, no documentation, no counter operations, no performance of any kind. Just a man in his kitchen at 5:30 in the morning with a cup of coffee and a window and the specific, unquantifiable experience of being safe in his own life. The coffee cooled in my hands. I didn't reheat it. I drank it at whatever temperature it reached while I stood there. And it was fine. Everything that morning was fine in the way that word is supposed to mean, not as a dismissal, but as an actual description. Fine, level, intact, whole. If you've lived with someone who is dismantling you from the inside, you know this moment. You know the strangeness of it. How the absence of threat feels almost as overwhelming as the threat itself, because your body has been calibrated to danger for so long that safety registers as disorientation before it registers as peace. You might be feeling some version of it right now, listening to this. If you are, sit with it. It's real, and it's yours. Weeks passed, then months. I drove to the cemetery on a Sunday afternoon in November. Claire's grave is in a quiet section of green lawn, under an oak tree that drops its leaves early every year. I installed a bench beside her headstone 3 years ago, a simple iron bench with her name engraved on the backrest. I've sat on it probably 100 times. This time I brought the brass key ring. The cemetery was empty. Ohio in November, gray sky, brown grass, the air carrying that particular cold that doesn't bite but settles into your bones like it plans to stay. The oak tree above Claire's grave was nearly bare, just a few brown leaves still clinging to the upper branches, twisting in a wind I couldn't feel at ground level. The iron bench was cold when I sat down. The cold came through my jeans immediately. A sharp, clean sensation that anchored me to where I was. I sat on Claire's bench, and I held the keyring in my palm. The keys on it were dead now. They didn't open anything. But the ring itself, Harold Bevan's ring from 2003, was still solid brass, still heavy, still worn smooth where my thumb had rubbed it 1,000 times over 22 years. I talked to Claire, not out loud at first, then out loud, because there was no one to hear, and no one to perform for, and no one to tell me the sound of my own voice meant I was losing my mind. I said, I think I kept him too close to me, and too far from you. He never learned what earning something feels like, because I never let him need to. I'm sorry, Claire. I'll do better with whatever time is left. The oak tree moved above me. A leaf came down and landed on my knee. I picked it up and turned it over and set it on the arm of the bench. The leaf was brown and dry and light as paper. It sat on the iron armrest for a moment. Then the wind took it, and it was gone. Garrett and Maeve had not contacted me in 3 weeks. The last communication was a text from Garrett that said, simply, I'm sorry. I hadn't responded. I didn't know how to respond to 2 words that were supposed to cover what he'd done. Maybe someday I would. Maybe someday the distance would be enough that I could look at my son and see something other than the man who told a room full of strangers that his father was disappearing. But not yet. What I could tell you, sitting on that bench with the dead keys in my hand and Claire's name at my back, was that the buildings were fine. The tenants were fine. The books were clean. The accounts were secure. The locks worked. The insurance was correct. Phillips Property Group was operating the way it had always operated, under the hand of the man who built it, and that man was not declining, was not confused, was not cooperative, and was not leaving. I closed my fist around the brass ring. The metal was cold from the November air. I squeezed until I could feel every key pressing into my palm. Dead keys that had once opened 12 buildings in 6 Ohio cities. And I thought about Harold Bevans handing me that ring in 2003, and I thought about how the word he used was trust. Take care of the tenants and the building takes care of you. Trust and love are different things. I know that now. I trusted my son with my life's work because I loved him. And I loved him because I raised him. And I raised him alone because Claire didn't get to stay. But trust earned and trust assumed are 2 different currencies. And I spent the wrong one for 22 years. I used to believe that giving someone everything was the same as teaching them the value of everything. I was wrong. It was the opposite. The only things that feel valuable are the things that cost you something to acquire. I paid for every building on that key ring with years of work. And they meant the world to me. Garrett received them as a gift, and they meant nothing to him except leverage. If you're listening to this, and you've felt someone close to you treating your openness as an access point rather than an offering, you don't need me to name the feeling. You already know it. It lives in the space between what you gave and how it was used. What I'd ask you is this. Do you know the difference between what you've built and what someone else claims? Because the paperwork matters. The locks matter. The documentation matters. Not because love isn't enough, but because love was never supposed to be the only wall between you and someone who's counting the bricks. That's my story. 1 brass key ring that outlived every lock it opened. 1 forged signature that used the wrong letter. And 1 silence at 5:30 on a weekday morning that taught me the sound of my own life when no one else was narrating it. If any of this sat with you in a way you want to put into words, the comments are yours. Tell me what you recognized, Tell me what you'd do differently, or tell me which door you're thinking about changing the locks on.